Hi, my name is Dr. John Douillard, and today I want to talk to you about a breathing technique called Inspiratory muscle training. In Ayurveda, it's called Pratiloma. And I'm going to teach you in detail how to do this technique in this video and why is it so important. Well, it's a technique that strengthens the muscles of inspiration or inhalation. It's an exercise that makes your diaphragm stronger, so you can contract deeper and you can breathe with more ease. 50% of elite athletes have what's called diaphragmatic fatigue, which means their diaphragms aren't contracting and relaxing completely as they should. So if 50% of the elite athletes have it, you and I, all of us, probably have some form of that. And with a respiratory pandemic looming, we have, one thing that we can do is to start to strengthen our diaphragm. Our diaphragm is a muscle that when it contracts, it pulls air into the lower lobes of your lungs, where the vast majority of the blood for exchanging oxygen in and CO2 out is, where the vast majority of the parasympathetic rest, rejuvenate, and digest nervous system is. And if you breathe deeply into those lungs, you create this more efficient respiratory machine, this ability to breathe more efficiently. And with a respiratory pandemic, it just makes sense that we all do everything we can to strengthen our lungs, to strengthen our muscles of inspiration, which is getting the air in. And the issue with this pandemic is that we have issues with breathing. This technique, respiratory or inspiratory muscle training, has been studied to actually support, and it's a well-documented practice in medical science for asthma, for breathing difficulties, for heartburn, indigestion, GERD, as well as heart failure. Everything that's above your diaphragm, your heart and your lungs, and everything that's below your diaphragm, your liver, your gallbladder, your spleen, your stomach, your pancreas, all of those are affected by an effective and efficient diaphragm. And if you have diaphragmatic fatigue or a lazy diaphragm, and you can strengthen that, boy, why in the world would we not want to do that with this pandemic looming? And the benefits, above and beyond the benefits for your lungs, are just mind-boggling. And I want to share some of those benefits with you. And again, I'm going to teach you how to do this breathing technique in detail here in just a few minutes. So please stay with me. Most of us just sit when we work and we kind of slunch, and what happens is we start breathing more shallow as opposed to breathing more deeply and efficiently. And when we breathe really shallow, we breathe oxygen in and CO2 out, oxygen in and CO2 out. And what happens is we never really start taking those deep breaths the way we should. And the rib cage has this thing called elastic recoil, which squeezes down in your heart and your lungs 26,000 times per day. So the technique that I'm going to give you is going to help to activate your diaphragm, so you have the benefit of a strengthening diaphragm 26,000 breaths per day, which is like a lot. But if the rib cage has become rigid because the elastic recoil of the lower ribs has gotten tighter and tighter and tighter, and your rib cage has literally become a cage, then it becomes way more difficult to breathe into those lower lobes of your lungs, and we just end up breathing really shallow little rabbit breaths that trigger the upper chest receptors, which are fight or flight or emergency in nature, which are immune compromising and degenerative. But when you breathe into the lower lobes of your lungs, this immune building and rejuvenative and turns on your digestive system. So this is what I wrote about in my first book, Body, Mind, and Sport. We did research, published it in the International Journal of Neuroscience. We found that when people breathe through their nose versus their mouth, their performance is enhanced, their brain waves change, become more relaxed. They go into alpha state, calm, coherent brain waves. They handle stress significantly better when they breathe through the nose, because the nose breathing is activating literally a neurological calm, which is really, really neat. So nose breathing exercise, another really good thing. Also, your nose, the paranasal sinuses produce a gas in your nose called, this is really more than a newsletter video. I'm sorry, this is more like a little seminar, but it's really important. In the paranasal sinuses, we produce a gas called nitric oxide, which won the Nobel Prize in 1998 in chemistry as the panacea molecule that cured everything. And it's powerfully immune promoting. So when you breathe through your nose, you're producing this gas which is lining your respiratory tract with nitric oxide, which protects you from infection. And there's studies after study after study to back that up. And I've written about that in many of my nose breathing articles, which is like pretty crazy research. That alone is a good enough reason to keep our mouths closed and breathe through our nose for sure. We're definitely when we're in public places. So when we breathe through our nose, we're getting all the benefits of starting to contract your diaphragm. But when you start to breathe really shallow, the diaphragm just doesn't contract very much anymore. It doesn't have to contract very much to get the air in the upper part of your chest. So we just end up breathing really, really shallow. You know, when I wrote my book for Body, Mind, and Sport, I asked a bunch of comparative anatomists and pulmonologists, and I interviewed them. And they told me that, you know, we have 5 lobes of our lungs, but we only need like 2. You don't need the other 5. And I sort of was like, that's interesting that you guys sort of just accept that, because to me that makes 0 sense that we have 5 lobes of our lungs and we only need 2. Why do we have 5? Did we just have them like for like a spare tire? I mean, it didn't make any sense to me. And now we have understanding of why we actually do have 5 lobes of our lungs, because the vast majority of the exchange takes place in the lower lobes of your lungs. And if you just breathe in those upper 2, what happens is you do this thing called over-breathing. And I have a really brilliant podcast coming out very soon with a man who wrote a book called The Oxygen Advantage, who took a lot of my original research on nose breathing benefits and took it to a whole nother level. And that podcast with Patrick McEwen is coming out very soon. So please stay tuned for that to get some more amazing details about the benefits of breathing, which are really critical. But when you don't have diaphragmatic contraction, because you don't really need it fully when you're breathing in the upper chest, you end up just breathing in oxygen and out CO2, in oxygen, out CO2. So why is that bad? Well, because the way the body works is you have oxygen in your blood. It's attached to your hemoglobin protein molecule. And that oxygen, if you took an oximeter reading, which this is what an oximeter reading looks like, this is a little oximeter, and you put it on your finger, and it'll tell you what your oxygen levels are. And that'll say like 98% or 97% or whatever that reading might be. And that's how much oxygen is literally in your blood. That is not how much oxygen is in your tissues, for example, okay? So it's like mine's 95% right now. So now if I were to hold my breath, okay, or create resistance or a little bit of air hunger, which happens when you breathe through your nose, you start to build up levels of CO2. If you breathe completely deeply into the lower lobes of your lungs, your breath will have to slow down to give it time to make that happen. And the CO2 levels will start to rise. And when your CO2 levels start to rise and you get a little bit of air hunger, then all of a sudden, all that oxygen in your blood, in your hemoglobin, attached to your hemoglobin, it gets dumped into your tissues and hyperoxygenates your tissues, okay? And then that means that the hemoglobin is empty. So then all the CO2 can hook onto that hemoglobin molecule and then take that molecule, that CO2, back to your lungs, and you breathe it out. And that's the mechanism. This oxygen stays on your hemoglobin molecule in your blood until you start to feel a little bit of air hunger. But because we overbreathe, we breathe little air in, little CO2 out, the CO2, the carbon dioxide that we breathe out, never has a chance to really build up in a way that's going to force the dumping of the oxygen into your tissues and really feed and hyperoxygenate your tissues, which gives you all kinds of protection against degeneration and boosts your immunity and a host of energy building, promoting factors as well. So this is the beginning of understanding of something called intermittent hypoxia, which I've written a lot about as well. And I want you to type in breath retention on my website at LifeSpa.com and read those articles, because I've been taking you guys on a journey for a while, teaching you the benefits of really understanding breathing and the remarkable benefits. So one of the techniques is called Pratiloma. There's an Ayurvedic breathing technique that is exactly like the inspiratory muscle training techniques that hospitals are using for breathing difficulties and heart failure issues and GERD and a host of other concerns that are well studied. And that breathing technique is called Pratiloma. Pratiloma means that you inspire, you breathe in through your nose with partially closed nostrils. So when you partially close your nostrils, you create resistance. When you create resistance, you create you force your diaphragm to contract, right? It's almost mimicking high altitude training. So if you were to close your nostrils just a little bit and you breathe through them all the way, you will feel underneath your rib cage here, your diaphragm contracting. So try that for me for a second. And you can do it in a traditional Ayurvedic way where you take your middle and ring finger and you your index finger and your middle finger, and you can do it this way. You can do it with your thumb and index finger. It doesn't really matter. The most important piece of the puzzle here is you get the resistance. So for you to visualize, you can see what I'm doing, just both fingers on the outside of my nostrils, closing them to about half or 3/4 of the way. So now I have to breathe in through these really almost blocked nostrils, but I'm forcing my inhale all the way. And when you do that with that resistance, you'll feel underneath your diaphragm, you'll feel it underneath your rib cage, you'll feel your diaphragm contracting. So go ahead and do that for a second. Take a big breath in and then let it out with open nostrils. Do it again. In and then let it out. And then again. All the way in, and that's with the top of that breath, you'll feel your diaphragm contract. I hope you feel that. And if you feel that diaphragm contract, ask yourself, boy, when was the last time I felt my diaphragm contract? Probably never. That's because we don't breathe like that. We don't force the diaphragm to create this massive contraction. And that's what's called inspiratory or inhalation muscle training. Training the muscles of inhaling to become really strong. So you have, in any situation of breathing difficulty or breathing compromise, you've strengthened that diaphragm, and that pandemic, you'll be ready for it because you've strengthened those muscles. If you're going to run a marathon, you train your muscles to run that marathon. If we're going to deal with this pandemic, we need to train the muscles of breathing to deal with this pandemic. I really believe wholeheartedly, the studies back me up. This is a technique that is 100% free. Anybody can do it, and the science shows it's used clinically to treat asthma and breathing difficulties who are at greater risk. Elderly people who have breathing difficulties, who don't breathe as well anyway, they're at greater risk. These are things that they should be doing for sure. Okay, so that's the breathing technique that you would do. So how would you do that? You would do that so you do that breathing technique. Hopefully you feel that. So you're going to take your nostrils and you're going to breathe in, all the way in and out with open nostrils. And again, in and out, just like that. And you do that about 10 times. Okay, and then take a little break and recover, and then do another set of that of 10, and then do another set of that of 10, and then 2 more, and that gives you 5. So you do 5 sets twice a day, in the morning when you wake up, and in the evening sometime before you go to bed, sometime after dinner, at least an hour after you eat, because this is not something you want to do after you eat your food, right? So that breathing technique has been shown to support GERD. Well, GERD is what Ayurveda calls upward moving digestion, where the stomach starts to push up against the diaphragm, adhere to the diaphragm, and even herniate through the diaphragm. Your stomach can do what's called a hiatal hernia. And this technique, by strengthening and contracting and relaxing, contracting and relaxing your diaphragm, and strengthening that muscle, has been shown in study after study after study to actually reduce the symptoms of GERD, which is phenomenal that you can do that without Prilosec, without these antacids. And how many people have this condition, which means how many people have diaphragmatic fatigue or a lazy diaphragm? So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about strengthening your diaphragm so you become young again, superhuman maybe even, because when you hear the benefits that I'm going to share with you in a minute, it's more on the superhuman side. And I'm not making this up. I got study after study to share with you here in just a second, so stay with me. So what I just shared with you was the basic inspiratory muscle training. But in Ayurveda, the Pratiloma wasn't just holding your nostrils and then creating resistance. And in Western medicine, they have these little things that you breathe in through your mouth and create resistance, and there's all kinds of ways they try to mimic and create the resistance training through your diaphragm become stronger. Many ways to do that. But in Ayurveda, it was also done with something called kumbhak, or breath holding, or breath retention. And that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the benefits really start to kick in. When you hold your breath, like I said a minute ago, the CO2 levels start to rise. And when the CO2 levels start to rise, all the oxygen just gets dumped into your tissues. And then all the CO2 gets pushed back to the hemoglobin and then carried, and you breathe that out. Then if you do another set of the deep breathing that I just shared with you, then you hyperoxygenate your blood. Your oximeter reading will actually probably go somewhere to 100 when you're doing the deep breathing, 99 or 100. And then when you breath hold, the CO2 levels will start to rise. Let me turn it on. The CO2 levels will start to rise, and what you'll begin to see is that your oximeter readings will start to go down, down, down. So right now I'm 95%. So if you can maybe all see that, sort of blinking like crazy, but it's at 96%. And that's normal. 96, 97, 98% is where you want to be. When you do the breath holding, then that number is going to start to crash on you, go down to the low 90s into the 80s. And when you're in the 80s, you're in what's called intermittent hypoxia. So intermittent hypoxia has been studied to do a handful of things. And please read my article on intermittent hypoxia and breath retention called Kumbhak in Ayurveda. In pranayama breathing techniques, prana means breath, kumbhak means, or ayama, prana is breath, ayama means breath hold or pause or break. So a pranayama technique is a technique of breathing that incorporates a holding or retention of your breath. From the original perspective, the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras or the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, clearly pranayama is not pranayama unless you hold your breath. And now we have all the science called intermittent hypoxia that gives these amazing studies to show what holding your breath can do therapeutically. Sort of like, we've all been heard about calorie restriction and intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating and all this. A little bit of starvation does magical things. Nobel Prize winning science on autophagy and all these benefits you get from a little bit of starvation. Not, a lot, just a little. Same thing seems to be happening with a little bit of suffocation. When you have a little bit of air hunger, that's when the CO2 levels are building up. And when that happens and you become tolerant to that, and what we're teaching you how to do is building up your CO2 tolerance. So you don't need to take a breath so quickly. You don't get out of breath feeling so quickly. That also will help you if you have a respiratory issue or a respiratory infection for that matter. So when you do a breath hold, the CO2 levels begin to build up. And that creates this little bit of suffocation, just like a little bit of starvation. And that little bit of suffocation seems to do some amazing things. And what those amazing things are, well, Lance Armstrong got busted for injecting EPO, erythropoietin, which is a hormone that boosts blood and endurance in his cells. And you make that all by yourself, according to the studies. You increase your own production of stem cells, which are rejuvenative, which everybody seems to be injecting these days. You increase something called the vascular endothelial growth factor, which repairs your arterial lining, which is really important as you age. There's a transcription factor number 51, which is called the guardian of the genome, which has been shown to protect your genes from damage and mutations and things like that. It's also been shown to lower your blood sugar powerfully. And some of you folks out there with type 2 diabetes or prediabetes, or those morning numbers just won't go down, I'm telling you, this technique is quite phenomenal, shockingly phenomenal for bringing those morning blood sugar numbers right down where they need to be. So it's really, really powerful. And of course, almost forgot, nitric oxide, which won the Nobel Prize in 1998. Not only is it produced in the paranasal sinuses, as I mentioned, but it's also produced when you do the intermittent hypoxia, which was the panacea molecule of 1998 that won the Nobel Prize. So nose breathing will increase the nitric oxide, and breath holding will increase the nitric oxide. So how did Ayurveda put together the Pratiloma in a way that would give you the ability to better get all these benefits. First of all, how do they even know that kumbhak, which means breath holding in pranayama, would have all these benefits? And the whole technique of pranayama isn't pranayama unless you do a breath hold, according to the original text, which is really quite amazing, actually, that they knew all that. So I'm going to teach you now how to do the Pratiloma, the inspiratory muscle training with a breath hold. And when you put the two together, you're literally talking about the Vedic technique called Pratiloma. Okay? So it's going to be very similar. You're going to do the same exact breath technique. You're going to do 10 breaths in, followed by a breath hold on the exhalation. And then you're going to do another 10 breaths in and out, followed by another breath hold after the 10th exhalation. And you're going to do that 5 times. So 5 rounds of 10 partially closed nostrils on the in, and a full open nostril on the exhale. Do 10 of those, followed by a breath hold. Okay? So we can do that a little bit here. My oximeter reading is pushing at 95%. Can you see that? It's blinking like crazy. I don't know if you guys can see that. It's at 95%. When I say, I think the camera's making it look funny. So we're going to do that breath hold, and then we're going to watch if you have an oximeter, which are very cheap, you can actually watch your numbers during the breath hold go down. If they go down into the 80s, you're in intermittent hypoxia, and you're getting those benefits just below 90. And if you have any discomfort, you should stop immediately. Dizziness or anything like that, you stop immediately on any of these breathing techniques. And you should always check with your doctor before you start any breathing technique, particularly a breathing technique that has a breath hold in it. Okay, so that said, let's go ahead and do it together. And we're going to do 10, and then we'll do a breath hold, and we'll talk about that, and then I'll let you go. Okay, so here we go. So it's inhale and out. And out. Fully in, right? And out. Partially closing your nostrils to create that diaphragmatic resistance. And out. And again. And out. At the very top of that breath, you feel that rib cage contracting, and that diaphragm contracting out rather. And out. And again. And out. You can pinch a little more if you have to, a little less if you have to. If you get dizzy at this point, you want to stop. But if you're okay, continue. And out. Feel that diaphragm, that you're doing the right thing. All the way out. 2 more. And out. And 1 more. And out. All the way out. And let it go and hold the breath. I don't know if you can see that or not, but it looks like it's blinking all over the place, but it's at 96% right now. My breath is still out. I'm talking as it goes out. It's starting to crash now. It's at 90. And then breathe. And it's still going to go down a little bit more, maybe into 89. So the first time you do it, you're not going to get it to drop down. Maybe it went from 98 to 90. And it's still at 90 now. And the second time you do it, the 10 breaths and follow, it'll go down a little lower to in the 80s. And the second time you do it, it'll go down a little lower and then a little lower. As long as you feel no real strong air hunger or urge to breathe, you're really in good shape. But once you're in the 80s, you're in what's called intermittent hypoxia. Mine's still in the 90s now, so we're at 90, so 89 would be intermittent hypoxia. So And that's just the first round. Every round it gets a little deeper, and then you end up with more oxygen, more CO2 tolerance built up, and that's dumping the oxygen in your cells. And if you're in intermittent hypoxia, read the article called Intermittent Hypoxia, Breath Retention, Kumbhak, which is recent, so it's right on my homepage, sort of, and at LifeSpa.com, and get all that information because it's phenomenal. The research is mind-blowing. So when you tie the breath holding, which is the intermittent hypoxia benefits, which are off the charts on their own, and then you add the inspiratory muscle training on the inside, on the inhalation to strengthen your diaphragm and give you the diaphragmatic strength that you need. And that diaphragm is now learning how to contract and relax and contract and relax and do its full job. Then it's going to start to make you breathe more fully. And people who don't breathe fully, they end up with breathing difficulties. They snore, they have sleep apnea, they have circulatory problems. A lot of sort of not great things begin to happen when you don't breathe correctly. And I've seen the miracles of nose breathing from my book. I wrote that book back in the 1980s. I wrote that book and have been using it ever since. And now with this understanding of diaphragmatic fatigue and all this new science coming out, intermittent hypoxia benefits, and you tie the two together with a breathing technique called Pratiloma. You do that again twice, once in the morning and once in the evening, and just watch the benefits. Pick yourself up an oximeter reading, super fun to play with. Remember, if you feel any dizziness or any air hunger that's uncomfortable, you immediately stop. Every time you do a breath hold, it should be effortless. And then when you feel you need to breathe, you take a little bit of a deeper breath. You just start to breathe again. So you do your 10 breaths followed by your exhalation breath hold, and as soon as you feel a little bit of air hunger you have to breathe, just go back into your next round of 10 inhalations with partially closed nostrils. That's the key. I have an article that goes step by step through this procedure and talk about a lot more of the science that I didn't even get into today on the inspiratory muscle training. Between that article and the intermittent hypoxia article, you'll get to see that really hopefully motivate you to do it. And for this pandemic, what a great thing to have is a stronger diaphragm. So if you do get sick, you've prepared yourself. You've trained for this event. And so good luck to you all, and stay healthy.